Imagine standing on a slab of steel in the middle of the ocean, where the ambient temperature hovers around 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air smells violently of burning jet fuel and vaporized grease. The noise is not just loud, it is a physical force that rattles your ribs and vibrates through the soles of your boots. Less than 50 feet away, a 60,000-pound fighter jet is chained to a steam-powered catapult. In exactly 2 seconds, that machine will be violently hurled from a standstill to 170 miles per hour, thrown over the bow into the unforgiving abyss of the sea. This controlled chaos is not an accident. It is the highly choreographed daily routine of the ultimate instrument of American power projection. We are talking about a vessel that does not just participate in naval warfare, but actively dictates the terms of global geopolitics. If you want to understand the brutal, calculated mechanics of global superpower dominance, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let us dive into the steel beast that defined an era. To comprehend the sheer strategic weight of the USS Nimitz, designated CVN-68, we have to rewind the clock and look at the deep historical roots of naval warfare. The concept of the aircraft carrier was forged in the fires of the Second World War. The United States Navy learned a very bloody lesson in the Pacific theater, specifically that the battleship was dead, and the aircraft carrier was the new undisputed king of the ocean. The Essex-class carriers proved that mass production of floating airfields could overwhelm an empire. But as the ink dried on the Japanese surrender in 1945, the rules of the game began to change rapidly. Jet aircraft entered the fray. Jets were heavier, faster, and required significantly more fuel and runway space than the propeller-driven planes of the Pacific War. The Navy responded with the Forrestal-class supercarriers in the 1950s, massive ships designed specifically to handle modern jets. But there was still a fatal flaw in the logistical chain, and that flaw was black oil. Conventional carriers burned thousands of gallons of fuel oil just to keep their own boilers running, severely limiting their range and tying them to vulnerable fleet oilers. How do you maintain absolute air superiority over the middle of the Atlantic or the Pacific when your nearest land base is 3,000 miles away, and your supply lines are constantly shadowed by enemy attack submarines? You bring the airbase with you, and you make sure it never, ever runs out of gas. This strategic conundrum led to the nuclear revolution, spearheaded by the notoriously demanding Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. Rickover understood that nuclear propulsion would sever the umbilical cord of the fleet oiler. The Navy built the USS Enterprise CVN-65 as the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. The Enterprise was a marvel, but it was also an engineering nightmare. It required 8 separate nuclear reactors to generate the necessary power, making it incredibly expensive to build and hellishly complicated to maintain. The Department of Defense realized they could not mass-produce the Enterprise design. They needed a new class of supercarrier, one that retained the unlimited range of nuclear power, but streamlined the engineering to allow for a standardized, repeatable production line. Enter the 1960s, a period of terrifying escalation in the Cold War. The Soviet Union, under the aggressive leadership of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, was rapidly transforming the Soviet Navy from a coastal defense force into a formidable blue water fleet. Gorshkov knew he could not match the United States carrier for carrier. The American industrial base, centered at the massive Newport News shipbuilding facility in Virginia, was simply too robust. Instead, the Soviets developed a radically different naval doctrine. They focused on sea denial rather than sea control. The Soviet strategy relied on swarms of nuclear-powered cruise missile submarines like the Oscar class, and land-based naval aviation, primarily the Tu-22M backfire bombers. These Soviet platforms were designed to do one thing, which was to fire massive, supersonic anti-ship missiles like the Kh-22 from hundreds of miles away to overwhelm the American carrier strike groups. The strategic correlation of forces was a classic asymmetrical nightmare. It was highly reminiscent of the heavily armored French knights at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, who believed their sheer mass and armor would carry the day, only to be decimated by a storm of English longbow arrows. The United States Navy was the armored knight, and the Soviet cruise missiles were the arrows. To survive this environment, the new American carrier could not just be a platform for launching planes. It had to be an absolute fortress, capable of absorbing staggering amounts of punishment while continuing to generate combat sorties. This requirement birthed the design of the Nimitz class. Authorized by Congress in 1967, the keel of the USS Nimitz was laid down in 1968. The physical dimensions and industrial effort required to build this ship defy casual comprehension. The Nimitz stretches 1,092 feet in length, roughly the size of the Empire State Building laid on its side. Its flight deck covers 4.5 acres. Fully loaded, it displaces over 100,000 long tons of water. To move this man-made mountain, engineers replaced the 8 cumbersome reactors of the Enterprise with just 2 massive A4W pressurized water reactors. These 2 reactors generate steam that drives 4 geared steam turbines, producing a staggering 260,000 shaft horsepower. Officially, the United States Navy states the top speed of the Nimitz is in excess of 30 knots. Unofficially, any sailor who has stood on the fantail during high-speed sea trials will tell you that a 100,000-ton chunk of steel moving at nearly 40 miles per hour through the ocean is a terrifying testament to American engineering. But speed is only one layer of defense. The true survivability of the Nimitz lies in its passive defense systems. The ship features a double hull design, with the space between the inner and outer hulls filled with specialized liquid compartments and void spaces, designed to absorb the kinetic energy and explosive overpressure of a Soviet torpedo or cruise missile strike. The vital spaces of the ship, including the reactor compartments, the combat direction center, and the magazines, are wrapped in 2.5 inches of Kevlar armor. The ship is divided into over 2,000 individual watertight compartments. The damage control doctrine is built on the hard-learned lessons of the USS Franklin in World War II, a carrier that was bombed and burned terribly but refused to sink because of the sheer stubbornness and compartmentalization of its crew. The Nimitz was built with the explicit assumption that it would take hits in a major superpower war, and its design ensures that even if it is bleeding, it can still throw a devastating punch. We must also analyze the logistical miracle that makes this warship function. A carrier is utterly useless without its air wing, and an air wing is useless without fuel and ammunition. Deep inside the belly of the Nimitz are massive storage tanks capable of holding over 3 million gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel. The magazines can hold millions of pounds of high explosives, from air-to-air missiles to laser-guided bombs. To operate this floating city, the Nimitz requires a crew of over 6,000 personnel. That is roughly 3,200 ships' company to drive the boat, run the reactors, and cook the meals, plus another 2,800 personnel belonging to the carrier air wing to fly and maintain the aircraft. Feeding this crew requires preparing over 18,000 meals a day. The desalination plants on board produce 400,000 gallons of fresh water daily. If the logistical supply chain of a single Nimitz-class carrier were applied to a civilian corporation, it would immediately rank among the most efficient logistics networks on the planet. This brings us to the core combat power of the vessel, which is the carrier air wing. In the Cold War era, the air wing was specifically tailored to defeat the Soviet threat we discussed earlier. The outer ring of defense was manned by the iconic F-14 Tomcat, a heavy fleet defense interceptor armed with the AIM-54 Phoenix missile. The Tomcat's sole purpose was to fly out hundreds of miles from the carrier and shoot down Soviet backfire bombers before they could launch their anti-ship missiles. Inside that ring, A-6 Intruder medium bombers provided all-weather strike capability, capable of delivering devastating payloads to land targets or enemy surface action groups. E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft acted as the radar eyes of the fleet, flying high above the carrier to detect incoming threats from over the horizon. EA-6B Prowlers provided electronic warfare support, jamming enemy radars and blinding the Soviet targeting networks. This integrated ecosystem of aircraft turned the Nimitz from a mere ship into a mobile sphere of absolute military dominance with a radius of over 500 miles. The Soviets looked at this perfectly synchronized system of American steam catapults, nuclear power, and integrated air wings, and they simply could not replicate it. They attempted to build their own aircraft-carrying cruisers equipped with ski jumps instead of steam catapults. They essentially hoped that gravity, strong headwind, and brute engine force would do the job of American steam engineering. It did not work out well for them, as their aircraft were severely limited in the amount of fuel and weapons they could carry off a ramp. This is a crucial historical parallel. Look back to 1906, when the British Royal Navy launched the HMS Dreadnought. That single battleship, With its all-big gun armament and steam turbine propulsion, instantly rendered every other battleship on Earth obsolete. It forced every rival navy to scrap their old playbooks and start from scratch. The commissioning of the USS Nimitz in 1975 had the exact same effect on the Cold War naval balance. It forced the Soviet Union to spend billions of rubles they did not have, trying to counter a ship that could appear anywhere on the globe, operate indefinitely, and project more firepower than the entire air forces of most sovereign nations. But building a 100,000-ton floating fortress, wrapping it in Kevlar, and loading it with supersonic fighters is only half the battle. The true test of this mechanical leviathan comes when the mooring lines are cast off. The nuclear reactors are pushed to 100% capacity, and the ship enters hostile waters where theory collides with the brutal reality of combat. Stepping out onto the flight deck of the USS Nimitz during cyclic operations is like stepping into the mouth of a mechanical leviathan. This 4.5-acre slab of non-skid coated steel is universally recognized as the most dangerous work environment on the face of the Earth. There are no guardrails. There are no designated safe zones. It is a chaotic ballet of 60,000-pound aircraft rolling around at high RPMs, driven by pilots whose visibility is severely restricted. To manage this insanity, the deck crew wears a highly specific, color-coded uniform system. The yellow shirts are the directors, the absolute masters of the deck, who orchestrate the movement of every aircraft with exaggerated hand signals. The green shirts operate the catapults and arresting gear, wrestling with heavy steel components in blistering heat. The red shirts are the ordnancemen, casually hauling 1,000-pound laser-guided bombs and highly volatile air-to-air missiles through a maze of spinning jet intakes. The purple shirts, affectionately known as grapes, handle the highly flammable JP-5 aviation fuel. How do you choreograph of explosive-laden jets on a pitch-black night in a raging sea state? You do not. You rely on muscle memory, sheer terror, and the absolute, unwavering discipline of 19-year-old kids from Ohio and Texas who hold the lives of multi-million-dollar fighter pilots in their grease-stained hands. The deck of the Nimitz is often compared to a busy airport, but that is a laughable understatement. It is more akin to operating a heavy industrial steel mill on the back of a bucking bronco during a hurricane, where one wrong step does not result in a safety violation, but in a sailor being sucked into a jet intake or cut in half by a snapping, arresting wire. The primary offensive mechanism of the Nimitz is the C-13-1 steam catapult system. The engineering behind this system is brutally effective. Steam generated by the two A4W nuclear reactors deep in the bowels of the ship is piped directly up to massive accumulators located just under the flight deck. When a fighter jet, like the F-14 Tomcat, is taxied onto the catapult, its nose gear is attached to a shuttle via a heavy steel launch bar. A holdback fitting is attached to the rear of the nose gear, anchoring the aircraft to the deck. The pilot pushes the throttles to full military power, or even afterburner, generating tens of thousands of pounds of thrust. The jet is screaming, trying to tear down the deck, but the holdback fitting keeps it pinned. Below deck, the catapult officer, the shooter, verifies the weight of the aircraft and calculates the exact amount of steam pressure required. They need roughly 90 pounds per square inch of steam pressure to launch a fully loaded Tomcat. When the shooter touches the deck and gives the signal, a massive valve opens, flooding the catapult cylinders with high-pressure steam. The holdback fitting snaps. In exactly 2 seconds, the shuttle violently accelerates the aircraft from 0 to 170 miles per hour, over a distance of just 300 feet. If the steam pressure is too low, you get a cold stroke, and the jet falls off the bow into the ocean, to be immediately run over by the 100,000-ton carrier. Recovering these aircraft is an equally violent affair. The Nimitz was originally equipped with 4 Mark 7 Mod 3 arresting gear wires stretched across the aft section of the flight deck. An incoming jet drops a heavy steel tailhook from its rear fuselage. The goal is to snag the 3rd wire, the optimal target for a safe landing. When the hook catches the 1.5-inch thick braided steel cable, the kinetic energy of the aircraft is transferred to an absolutely massive hydraulic engine located below the deck. This engine acts as a giant shock absorber, dissipating the energy and bringing the aircraft from 150 miles per hour to a dead stop in just 320 feet. The most counterintuitive part of this process is what the pilot does with the throttle. The exact millisecond the aircraft's wheels hit the steel deck, the pilot slams the throttles forward to maximum power. Why would you accelerate when you are trying to stop? Because if the tailhook bounces and misses all 4 wires, a situation known as a bolter, the pilot needs maximum thrust to fly off the angled deck and try again. If they cut the power upon touchdown and miss the wires, the jet will simply roll off the edge of the ship and sink. But what happens when the outer ring of F-14s fails and an enemy cruise missile breaks through to the carrier? The Nimitz relies on its point defense systems. The last line of defense is the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, commonly known as the CIWS. Imagine a 20mm, 6-barrel Gatling gun bolted to an autonomous radar system. It fires depleted uranium or tungsten armor-piercing rounds at a cyclic rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. When the CIWS tracks an incoming sea-skimming missile, it unleashes a literal wall of heavy metal into the air, acting like a mechanical buzzsaw to shred the missile before impact. Complementing the CIWS is the RIM-7 Sea Sparrow missile system, designed to intercept targets at a slightly longer range. It is a highly capable layered defense, but the ultimate truth of naval warfare remains unchanged. The best defense against a supersonic anti-ship missile is not being in the geographical coordinates where the missile is aimed. The theoretical perfection of these systems was put to the ultimate grueling test on April 24, 1980. The Nimitz had been deployed to the Indian Ocean to serve as the primary launching pad for Operation Eagle Claw. The mission was audacious, highly classified, and incredibly complex. The objective was to rescue 52 American hostages held at the United States Embassy in Tehran, Iran. The Nimitz was tasked with launching 8 heavily modified RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters. These massive, twin-engine heavy-lift helicopters were designed for minesweeping, but they were the only platforms with the payload capacity and range to carry the Delta Force operators and their equipment deep into the Iranian desert. At 1900 hours, the 8 Sea Stallions lifted off the deck of the Nimitz, heavily laden with fuel and combat gear. The flight path required them to fly hundreds of miles over the dark, featureless Iranian desert at an altitude of just 200 feet to avoid detection by Iranian radar networks. The operation quickly deteriorated into a logistical and environmental nightmare. The helicopters flew directly into a haboob, a massive suspended dust storm that reduced visibility to absolute zero. The fine, powdery sand infiltrated the engines, avionics, and rotor hubs. The temperature inside the cockpits soared. The physical and psychological toll on the Marine Corps pilots was devastating. 2 hours into the flight, Helicopter number 6 experienced a catastrophic failure of its main rotor blade inspection system and was forced to abandon the mission, landing in the desert. The remaining 7 helicopters pushed through the blinding dust, but the friction of the environment was relentless. Helicopter number 5 suffered a total failure of its primary hydraulic system and had to return to the Nimitz. The remaining 6 arrived at the designated staging area, a remote salt flat known as Desert 1. The plan required a minimum of 6 operational helicopters to proceed to the next staging area outside Tehran. But upon landing at Desert 1, it was discovered that helicopter number 2 had suffered a critical failure of its secondary hydraulic system, rendering it unflyable. The mission commander, Colonel Charlie Beckwith, faced a brutal mathematical reality. He needed 6. He only had 5. The mission was aborted. The failure at Desert 1 was a bitter pill, exposing the extreme fragility of complex, multi-branch special operations. It was a logistical overreach reminiscent of Operation Market Garden in World War II, where the brilliant plan on paper disintegrated the moment it met the friction of reality, weather, and mechanical limits. The tragedy was compounded during the chaotic refueling and extraction process at Desert 1, when a Sea Stallion helicopter collided with an EC-130 transport plane. The resulting fireball illuminated the desert night, killing 8 American servicemen. The battered, exhausted survivors eventually made their way back to the Nimitz. The carrier had performed its role perfectly, launching the aircraft in total secrecy. But it was a grim reminder that even the most powerful ship in the world cannot control the weather or the inherent unreliability of complex machinery pushed past its breaking point. Fast forward just over a year to August 19th, 1981. The geopolitical theatre had shifted from the deserts of Iran to the sparkling blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The Nimitz was now the centerpiece of a massive freedom of navigation operation. Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi had arbitrarily claimed the entire Gulf of Sidra as sovereign Libyan territorial waters, drawing what he called the line of death across the map. President Ronald Reagan, adopting a distinctly aggressive foreign policy posture, ordered the United States Navy to sail directly across that line. The Nimitz and its battle group cruised into the Gulf of Sidra, an open challenge to the Libyan military. At 0700 hours, the Combat Direction Center aboard the Nimitz detected hostile radar tracks lifting off from a Libyan airbase near Sirte. Two F-14 Tomcats from Fighter Squadron 41, the Black Aces, were already on station flying a combat air patrol. The lead Tomcat, callsign Fast Eagle 102, was piloted by Commander Henry Kleeman. His wingman, in Fast Eagle 107, was Lieutenant Lawrence Muczynski. The E-2 Hawkeye radar plane vectored the Tomcats toward the incoming bogies. The radar signature identified the targets as Soviet-built Su-22 fitters, heavily armed ground attack aircraft. What happens when a third-world dictatorship attempts to test the airspace of a 100,000-ton sovereign American airfield? They get a very brief, very violent lesson in the technological gap of the late 20th century. The intercept geometry was established. The two Tomcats dropped down to 500 feet above the water, accelerating to Mach 0.9, closing the distance at a combined speed of over 1,000 miles per hour. Engaging an F-14 Tomcat in air-to-air combat with a lumbering Su-22 fitter is tactical suicide. The fitter was designed to drop unguided bombs on ground targets, not to dogfight the premier air superiority fighter of the United States Navy. Despite the overwhelming technological disadvantage, as the aircraft closed to within a few miles, the lead Libyan pilot made a fatal decision. He fired an AA-2 Atoll heat-seeking missile directly at Commander Kleeman's Tomcat. The Atoll was a crude rear aspect missile, meaning it was designed to be fired at the hot exhaust tailpipe of an enemy jet. Firing it head-on at a fast-moving target was a desperate, ineffective maneuver. The missile failed to track and dropped harmlessly into the Mediterranean. The American rules of engagement were clear. They had been fired upon. They were now authorized to kill. The response was immediate, ruthless, and executed with surgical precision. The Gulf of Sidra engagement was not a battle. It was a high-noon, quick draw right out of the American Wild West, executed at 500 miles per hour. The Libyans cleared their holsters first, but the Americans had better aim, better guns, and absolutely zero hesitation to pull the trigger. Both Tomcats pulled violent, high-G turns, utilizing the massive lift generated by their variable sweep wings to outmaneuver the sluggish fitters. Commander Kleeman pulled his Tomcat aggressively behind the lead Libyan jet. He achieved a solid tone in his headset, indicating his AIM-9L Sidewinder missile had locked onto the target. The AIM-9L was a revolutionary weapon, an all-aspect heat seeker that tracked the friction heat generated by the airframe itself, not just the engine exhaust. Kleeman squeezed the trigger. The Sidewinder leapt from the launch rail, leaving a trail of white smoke. Seconds later, the missile detonated perfectly on the tail section of the lead Su-22. The Libyan jet disintegrated into a fireball, the pilot ejecting just before the airframe shattered. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Muczynski dropped onto the tail of the second fitter. He fired his own sidewinder. The missile tracked flawlessly, impacting the second Libyan jet and blowing it out of the sky. 2 enemy aircraft destroyed in less than 60 seconds. The Tomcats turned back toward the Nimitz, leaving 2 parachutes drifting down toward the water. The Nimitz had proven its absolute dominance in the Mediterranean. It had demonstrated that its air wing could swat down hostile fighters with casual efficiency. The ship had survived the logistical nightmare of Eagle Claw and the sudden violence of the Gulf of Sidra. But the true test of this nuclear titan was yet to come. A massive, multi-carrier theatre war in the blistering heat of the Persian Gulf, where the threat was not just a pair of rogue jets, but a massive entrenched army, a sea filled with deadly contact mines, and a sky choked with anti-aircraft fire. The Persian Gulf in the spring of 2003 presented a radically different tactical environment than the deep blue waters of the Mediterranean or the open Pacific. The USS Nimitz, having completed a massive mid-life nuclear refueling and complex overhaul at the Newport News shipyard, steamed into the 5th Fleet area of responsibility for Operation Iraqi Freedom. This was no longer about playing a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with Soviet nuclear submarines or swatting down isolated Libyan fighter jets. This was about projecting sustained, overwhelming combat power against a heavily entrenched land army in a confined space. The carrier was operating in the ultimate literal nightmare. The Persian Gulf is shallow, crowded, and perfectly suited for asymmetric warfare. The threat matrix had shifted from supersonic cruise missiles launched from bombers to thousands of cheap, untrackable contact mines and fast attack craft, swarming in the narrow choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. How does a 100,000-ton nuclear supercarrier adapt to a knife fight in a phone booth? It leverages its absolute dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum and its organic, self-contained logistics. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, Carrier Air Wing 11 aboard the Nimitz flew thousands of combat sorties. The F-14 Tomcats, operating in their twilight years, had been ingeniously transformed from pure fleet defenders into strike aircraft known as bombcats. They were equipped with the low-altitude navigation and targeting infrared for night, or LANTIN, pods. A radar intercept officer sitting in the back seat of a Tomcat could lace a target from 20,000 feet, guiding a 2,000-pound GBU-24 laser-guided bomb directly through the roof of an Iraqi Republican Guard command bunker. The FCA-18 Hornets provided the bulk of the rapid strike capability, cycling off the catapults day and night. The core tactical lesson here is the sheer modularity of the supercarrier. You do not need to redesign the ship to change its entire strategic mission. You simply swap out the aircraft on the flight deck. Think back to the Pacific Campaign of World War II, commanded by the ship's namesake, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. The United States Marines and Army infantry had to bleed for every single inch of coral and volcanic ash on Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa just to secure stationary airfields close enough to bomb the Japanese mainland. The strategic paradigm shifted completely with the advent of the nuclear carrier. The Nimitz is a sovereign, moving piece of American territory. It does not require a status of forces agreement. It does not require a foreign government's permission to launch strikes or store munitions. When host nations in the Middle East deny airspace or basing rights, the President of the United States simply moves a 4.5-acre airfield right off their coast. Why spend billions of dollars begging for vulnerable land bases when you can bring your own heavily armored nuclear-powered island? The reality of modern geopolitics is that political alliances are fragile and temporary, but two A4W pressurized water reactors driving a steel hull are highly dependable. But projecting this level of destruction requires a logistical umbilical cord that stretches across the globe. Let us break down the brutal economics and logistics of keeping the Nimitz in the fight. A nuclear carrier does not need black oil for its own engines, but its aircraft burn through millions of gallons of JP5 aviation fuel, and its crew of 6,000 consumes roughly 18,000 meals every single day. This requires the intricate, highly dangerous ballet of underway replenishment, commonly known as UNREP. Imagine driving two massive ships, the Nimitz and a fast combat support ship like the USS Sacramento, side by side at 15 knots, separated by only 150 feet of churning ocean. Heavy steel cables are shot across the gap with modified M14 rifles. Fuel hoses and cargo pallets, loaded with 2,000-pound bombs, are transferred via sliding paddies suspended over the water, all while the ships pitch and roll in the swells. It is a terrifying display of heavy industrial seamanship. If the helmsman of either ship makes a 1-degree steering error, the hydrodynamic forces will pull the vessels together, resulting in a multi-billion-dollar collision. From an intelligence and command perspective, the Nimitz operates as the central nervous system of the entire battle group. The Combat Direction Center, or CDC, located deep inside the hull, is a dark, freezing cold room illuminated by dozens of radar scopes and tactical data links. It ingests a massive flow of data from military satellites, E-2C Hawkeye airborne early warning planes, and the Aegis phased RA radars of its escorting cruisers. The CDC creates a real-time, three-dimensional picture of the battle space for hundreds of miles in every direction. The tactical action officers inside this room do not just look out of windows. They fight the ship through screens, managing a defensive bubble that tracks thousands of airborne and surface contacts simultaneously. Politically and economically, the carrier is the ultimate instrument of gunboat diplomacy. There is a famous, albeit cynical, saying in Washington: when a crisis breaks out anywhere in the world, the first question the commander-in-chief asks is, where are the carriers? The mere presence of the Nimitz off the coast of a hostile nation forces their military planners to completely alter their calculus. It is 100,000 tons of sovereign deterrence. To understand the economic and political weight of this, compare it to the Union Navy's Anaconda Plan during the American Civil War. In the 1860s, sea denial required hundreds of individual wooden ships spread thin across thousands of miles of Confederate coastline, constantly vulnerable to weather, disease, and supply shortages. The Nimitz consolidates that entire strategic blockade effect into a single, concentrated strike group. A modern carrier strike group possesses more offensive firepower than the entire militaries of most sovereign nations. We are talking about 70 to 90 combat aircraft, escorted by Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, packing hundreds of Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, with a Los Angeles or Virginia-class nuclear fast attack submarine lurking below the thermocline. Consider the microenvironment of the ship during a combat deployment in the Middle East. The Persian Gulf in the height of summer pushes the ambient temperature on the flight deck to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The abrasive non-skid surface literally melts the rubber soles of the cruise boots. The steel catapult tracks radiate heat like open industrial ovens. Yet the sortie generation rate must remain constant, launching and recovering aircraft every 45 seconds during cyclic operations. The nuclear reactors hum silently deep below, producing 260,000 shaft horsepower, while the massive air conditioning plants struggle to keep the delicate electronics in the combat direction center from melting down. The ship is a constant study in thermodynamic and psychological extremes. The USS Nimitz, CVN 68, is much more than just a warship. It is the physical, steel manifestation of post-World War II American military doctrine. It was born in the intense paranoia of the Cold War, designed to absorb the apocalyptic blows of Soviet bombers. Yet, it adapted seamlessly to the asymmetrical precision strike warfare of the 21st century. It proved that nuclear propulsion, combined with massive industrial scale, could create an unassailable floating fortress. As the Nimitz approaches the end of its planned 50-year service life, making way for the new electromagnetic catapults of the Ford-class carriers, its legacy is permanently etched in the history of the conflicts it shaped. It never fought the apocalyptic, world-ending fleet action it was originally designed for. And that is precisely the point. Its sheer existence, its capability for sudden and overwhelming violence, was a deterrent so absolute that no adversary ever dared to challenge it on the open ocean. The ultimate victory of a weapon of war is not measured by the battles it fights, but by the wars it prevents simply by existing. Now, I want to hear your tactical assessment in the comments below. What do you believe is the single greatest vulnerability of a modern nuclear supercarrier? A. Hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles. B. Advanced ultra-quiet diesel-electric submarines. C. Cyber warfare and electronic jamming of its data links. Drop your answer in the comments.